Okay, here's an image that's got a good range of contrast, tonal contrast, and you're going to see in the bottom there's a light over dark, dark over light, and when you flip-flop like that, going light over dark and dark over light and so on, if you keep reversing that, you can get a lot of spatial depth, or the appearance of spatial depth, okay? The other thing that's happening too is we've got some real warm colors in the foreground, and they go to kind of a monochrome blue in the background. Okay, so we're losing more red as it goes back into space, and as long as we get a gradient or a change in that, there is some blue in the foreground, and then there's more of it in the background. That also adds to this feeling of spatial quality, less contrast, cooler color, but also going towards monochrome, from a variety of hue in the foreground to more of a monochrome in the background. All those things add to this. So, you know, and all those things are calculated when they, you know, when he did this. So in this image, you can see how he's managed the edges and stuff like that. And it's more realistic with more handling of, you know, some of the nuances on the minor planes and stuff. So you get this more lifelike effect. But you can see clearly that his intention to maintain the light on his shoulder, moving down his arm, is where he wants the greater, wants you to look. So that's where the greater contrast is, and those things are accentuated. The smaller breakup, the breakup of smaller parts is the shadowing on his eye and nose and stuff in his features, and then his left hand is coming out, the separation of his fingers. Okay, that's an important characteristic there. Second to that, or you know, secondary to that, are his ribs and muscle definition. Okay, but it's really the high contrast of the small marks happens in his face and hands. So that keeps our focus there. And then we lose edges and stuff all over the background, and we keep the tonal contrast high where you want the viewer to look. Is that clear on this one? This one's, you know, just this is a piece of visual development art for an animated film, but still, it still applies. There's still gradients at work that soften your passage. There's light over dark and dark over light. It continues on through, and so, you know, it's the same principles apply. Look at the contrast range here, okay? And you can get the mood out of this because the tonal contrast range, and then we have something like this that has a different tonal contrast, and the range here is quite a bit different. It's mostly light with some of the medium and then a couple little dark accents. So it's a little bit more dreamlike in its effect. The question was, is the gradient in the sky counterchange? It's kind of counterchange. Now, what would need to occur would be if the tree. I'll draw that out. I'll show you. I can draw that here. If your tree was like this, and here's your sky. If your sky is a gradient getting lighter. There's another pencil here. There we go. If your sky is like this and it's getting lighter, that's a gradient, right? What would have to happen is your tree would have to go light to dark. And that's where counterchange will go beyond your local values. It expands beyond your local values. And that was what happened with Bambi, and it doesn't happen that much in nature. This is, you know, it's a kind of a contrived plastic way of bending space. But this would be a more of an example of, you know, of a direct counterchange. Okay, you can see that there's a good amount of tonal contrast, and this is medium. and then there's a good amount of tonal contrast. But you can also see where they want you to focus and what's going on. Where there's areas of greater contrast is where you're gonna where your eye is gonna go, and smaller high contrasting marks are gonna that's what's gonna kind of move your eye. So the characters over on the right by the cliff, and also the ridge where it's really darkest against the lighter light from that orange behind is those are the two areas of greater contrast. The ridge line at the top, because the background is light but it's saturated, that saturation again creates the illusion of greater contrast. Okay, it's not greater tonal contrast because it's darker than the area in the fog down below, but the saturation makes it saturation to the neutral makes it appear that way. Move up here. And you can see the saturation here really stands out, but it's a whole different proportion of tonal contrast here than the previous one. So you get a whole different mood with this. I posted a couple of other images that have range of contrast. Again, these were built on top of or painted from life, but they were painted manipulating the values a little bit. So I was looking for these simplified value groups. And in something like this, let me point this out. Okay, so in a situation like this, I'm going to look at my initial matrix is, I'll just lay that in roughly. I'm going to see the form on her face, cast shadow down here, like this. Her hair is dark and it's silhouette, so I'm going to combine that with my dark shape. This shape goes right into my shadow shape back here. Her arm goes into shadow here like this. This is dark, so I'm going to make sure this stays dark as well. So this is, I'm building that matrix. Eliminate this a little bit. And my third value, so this would be the two values. My third value would be this. So I have black, white, and this. So this is my basic matrix, okay? So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at it and say, okay, out of these different zones, which one has the greater contrast and the highest breakup of small parts? Well, right in here. I'm going to want this to be that place that the viewer is going to look. And so I'm going to look to make sure that I'm getting that contrast in here. So this is my area of greater contrast within this zone, okay? And a little shadow there, a little shadow there. So I'm getting the greatest contrast in this area, okay? My next area of contrast is going to be in the white area, right? So there's going to be some of these going on in there, right? I'll lighten this up just a little bit. Okay? And then this. Okay, so really what's happening is I can say this is my light, medium, and dark. Okay, and then once I get those areas, then I'm going to say, okay, where's my areas of greater contrast? So I get my three values. Okay, and then I'm going to look at them and say, what areas have the greatest contrast? Okay, what areas have the greatest contrast? Okay, 1, 2, or 3. And 2 had the greatest contrast in this zone. So I make that the area that I maintain and push contrast, and then I minimize it in the other areas. Okay? So first you set up your matrix, then you look at out of these groups, where's my value ranges, and which area has the greatest contrast, and which has the least contrast, while you're still looking at those simple groups. Now when you do that, you're doing the total organization right there. You come up with the organization for your whole plan can be really straightforward that way. And then as you put things in, then you can start looking at nuances as long as you maintain that hierarchy. And when you set that up, that's going to help your composition read in the priority that you initially set out to make that happen. Okay? Let me go to the next image up here too. Now that first image, this image is a case where it was ambient lit, just flat ambient light, okay, as opposed to the previous. So in the previous image, it was very apparent that the greater contrast was in this light area here. Now in this image, I'll do the same thing for this. In this image, this was quite different. So in this image, I'm looking at a setup that's something like this. Okay, so in a situation like this, I'm going to look for the areas that have the greatest contrast. Or if I look at my matrix, I'm going to say, okay, this is the area that's the dark. I'm going to just go for my darks. I'm looking for that dark pattern. Okay, so here's my dark. Also, I can see his boots. I'm going to do that. And my medium value is going to be back here. Okay. And I might have a little bit of a difference in here. Let me see. I'll put I might have his cuffs in that same medium value. And then maybe this goes in that medium value. Okay. Okay, so now I got to set up here where I've got these three values, and I can say, okay, in this image, where do I want to put my greatest contrast? In what zone am I going to put the greatest contrast? Now, again, I might just say in his face, his face is going to have the greatest concentration of small marks, right? So I can put medium value marks in here, and because they're small marks, they're going to get attention. Now, these aren't my darkest marks, but they're the small arrangement of small marks in here. So just by doing that, even if it's just the light to the medium, I'm getting that. But if I look at my range, there's a really light value range. Remember, I'm taking my groups now, my value groups, and I can say, okay, well, now I can put that in there. I'm going to do the same thing with his hands, right? And I might have a little bit darker, in a bit those areas. So this might be my area of focus. So now I set my contrast range. I know that, oh, well, there's some other areas where I have another bit of value range in here. And that might be this. Okay. And this. Kind of give him one big fat leg. So you can see how I can balance these things out. And the same thing if I'm going to say, okay, there is a bit of contrast in the darks as well. I know what range I'm going to have to stay in a certain value range in order that it doesn't compete with this area up here. If I kind of proceed in this way, I'll always establish what my greatest range of contrast is. And then what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to be able to work against that range. I won't make it compete. Oftentimes what we end up doing is we just start rendering something and we put in too much contrast. And then you need to or you end up putting more contrast in to make something stand out even more. And you end up with this high contrast on high contrast, and it starts looking like metal. It becomes an arms race because you don't have a priority of what's important. So this is just a way of setting up set your basic values, and then look at your value ranges, and then look at your breakup and say, okay, what area has the greatest contrast and which area has the least contrast, and start building those against one another or work with one another. So one area always stays dominant and the other becomes subordinate to that. Okay? Just keeping your priorities straight. Again, high major key and a high minor key. A lot of contrast. It's just a warm, cool painting, but the values are managed so well and designed very nicely so that you get real clarity in the image. You can see the shadow of the snowbank on the left side of the road. tendency would be, I know for me and a lot of folks, tendency would be to make it as dark as the shadow under the tree on the right. You see in that little valley area how that shadow in the snow gets really dark there? That might be a tendency, but if you did that, you wouldn't get the reflection of snow on snow filling that light source, and it just wouldn't be right, okay? And that's where I say you'd end up chasing your tail. You get too much contrast, and you keep trying to add more contrast, and it just doesn't work. Here's a great little movie still because of its directional. It's high contrast and directional quality. We're going to talk about line next week, and when we do, eye line is very, very strong, and it's a dominant. It can be a really strong factor, particularly in some of these German expressionist kind of images they created here, where you have all the throngs of people. They are all staring at the one guy, and so all of their eye lines focus all in towards that one guy, and he's the only one that's real frontal with his arms raised, looking up. The others, their arms are down. You don't see their hands. Their arms are down, and they're looking. The ones in the back who are more frontal, we see them looking down. But it's kind of a foreboding moment, kind of like this one. This was drawn. This was a layout design, and of course the action was going to happen on that lit portion of that branch across there. So with all these directional lines, with all of the high contrast set up, no leaves, these spiky kinds of shapes, they'll add to more of a foreboding kind of a mood. Another German expressionist image deals with space. This one, high contrast, and if there's high contrast in the foreground and high contrast in the background, that creates an ambiguous space. Okay? We would normally think of it as like high contrast outside, high contrast might be in the foreground, and diminished contrast in the background. If you get the same or greater, then you end up with an ambiguous situation. It seems a little bit odd, okay? And that's kind of where they're going with this. A lot of the lights and shadows and stuff were painted right on the walls. Here are a couple images, again, where the values are contrived. There's not distinguishing light direction. They're not counterchanged. They're just light-dark pattern shapes. Just to move your eye or focus your eye into these different arrangements. And the one on the bottom being a nighttime thing with what you might consider a moonlight. There's a little less tonal contrast than the one above. And so it's going to give you that kind of a more moody feeling. The one up above is a little bit more startling because it has a little brighter, higher contrast. So it's going to feel a little more bright. And then we go real bright with a Sorolla, okay? And look at how high key this image is. Now, if you squint at this image, you're going to see there's a lot of light medium value. There's a lot of real white in here, but there's a lot of light medium value as well. And he plays kind of in this territory. That allows him to get a good amount of saturation in that light medium value, and still has some strong darks. Okay, I want you to take a look at the other images in here. I've given descriptions on those, and you can take a look at these images. They're really kind of interesting. Where I'm going to point this out, where the image on the right of the young woman, there's a strong matrix of form matrix, light versus shadow. Okay, on the left, a Mazonis painting. And in Mazonis' painting, he changes the value structure, contrives the value structure so it's more notan. There are shadows on those white robes, but the greater contrast comes between the light-dark patterning that he created in here. And then, of course, the only area of chiaroscuro that is of high contrast is this little area right there, and that's him. So he's made himself pretty much the most important person in that painting, okay, by giving himself the greatest amount of contrast on his face and the directional lines that are moving around the wing and everything else. He's the one holding the sword of dark, that's dark over light, and all those shapes. Look at the folds under his arm. They all radiate around him, okay? So they all go up towards him, so those shapes are real important. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into shape as well. So all these things are reinforcing that. And I mentioned these in contrast to this next image that I want you to take a look at too. This is Thomas Moran painting, and this is a Hudson River School of Artists, and their mantra, or their direction really was they were painting the vast outdoors, these beautiful landscapes that go on and on and on and on. They were going out into this new frontier in this new land of America, and they were trying to represent that in their paintings. And if you're going to say, if what you're saying is, look at this vast land that goes on and on, take a look at this image. There's multiple focal points in this image. This image is, I think it's around 9 by 14 feet tall. I mean, it's a massive painting, and it's at the museum at the Geometry Museum, and it's a very, very impressive painting to go stand in front of, because you're dwarfed by this whole thing. I mean, that's part of it. It's there in a monumental scale to dwarf you compared to its, massive presence, but also with these high contrasting focal points going one over the other, you could crop this into many, many paintings. But having multiple focal points in this painting really kind of creates the effect that, you want to say, oh, look over here. Oh, now look over here. Now look over here. Now look over here. And that's directly in line with what their mission statement was. It was that this land goes on, and it's full of beauty wherever you look. So this is a case where, the design of these paintings falls right in line with the mission statement of the artist. So that's how we know that these things are really thorough in the way they break them down. It's really great to see. I mentioned a couple things about all of these images, how you can break down your tonal contrast in these little bits. There's some images here of this house with an impending tornado coming, and different bits of contrast and how that might play out. So take a look at those. Some other Sargent paintings, a Sargent and Whistler painting, and how they manipulated the values and moved your eye through those images. We talked a little bit before. If you're interested in film, this is how your story might play out, how you might work your values or any of your visual components in the course of a story. And then we get into a couple other images of different artists that really look at tonal contrast to gain clarity and direct your eye. Capturing a mood, like this. You see again, this is more dreamlike. It's overall medium to dark and medium to dark contrast. Where the upper image here is overall light with high contrast. There's a couple that are overall dark with high contrast as well. Clearly directing your eye where to look. Here's an illustration that has a lot of contrast in it as well, and you're going to see that there are, in the figures and stuff, there's a lot of gradients that aren't necessarily form. Okay, so this is something where they're contrived a little bit and not showing form. And I'm showing you all this variety of things just because I don't want you to think that this management of values only applies to one art form. It really applies to just image making in general, and there's many, many ways you can interpret it. So that's why I want to give you a good amount of examples of how you can interpret patterning these tonal arrangements. Okay, so I'm going to go on down here. You can take a look at all of these. You can break them down, do sketches of these. For homework, what I want you to do is I want you to look at these images. We got a couple images up here, okay? And what I want you to do is do a tonal breakdown of these images, or I want you to draw these much like I did the little sketches, where you look at look at your tonal arrangement. Start off with your matrix, your 3 values, okay? And then I want you to expand it into your broader values and determine where's your area of focus and where's your area of greatest contrast. Okay? And create the hierarchy of breakup in these different zones. Okay? I've selected these images because they have a combination of chiaroscuro. They also have a different tonal textures or patterns on them as well. So you're going to be working and integrating both of those together to some degree. I'll show you the other one up here as well. You can take a look at this and you can see there's a lot of high contrast in on the buttons and the zipper on her coat. But take a look at her white dress. There's a good amount of texture in that zone too. Okay? Where a coat is very flat in its design, you're going to see a degree of texture in her dress, and then you're going to see form in her face and hair. So I want you to balance those things. If you want, you can change up the hierarchy of those. Okay? Right here, the tonal contrast on her face is greater than that on her dress. You could switch that around, see what happens. Okay? But my point with this is explore these things, but do it with a purpose. So make the conscious effort to say, okay, this is my area of focus, increase contrast here, diminish the contrast other places, and you can shift that around. You can have fun with that, but make sure that you're just doing it and managing it that way. Okay, so thanks for joining us, and remember, have fun with some of this homework. Take those images and change them up a little bit. So you're focusing or you're directing us on how to look at your image and where you want to put our focus. So whether it's something that you are doing, you can take advantage of these and don't feel that you have to make the most aesthetically pleasing piece. You might make the background more textured or whatever. That doesn't matter. What really matters is that you're changing these areas up consciously and manipulating them, because that's freedom right there. And when you start doing these things, then you're gonna look for those things in your next pieces, and you'll be able to manage them more clearly. So feel free to experiment, be real broad with that, just as long as you keep things in a dominant to subordinate levels.